Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Reserve Study News webinar here in 2021. As Paige mentioned, I'm Robert, and I'll be getting our program started today, and I'll hand it off to DJ in just a few minutes. We've got a great lineup of webinars planned for 2021, so we hope to have you join us for a number of our programs throughout the year. And we present these webinars because of this picture. This is the view outside my bedroom window of the first home I owned, unit number 8, as part of a 71-unit condominium. I was mortgaged up to my eyeballs, as you commonly are in your first home, so I figured I should care about what was going on with the association. I quickly became president of the board, but I found I wasn't prepared for so many of the financial decisions: how much to collect, how much to spend, and how much to set aside. And that's fundamentally what led to founding Association Reserves. There are answers to those questions, and I just didn't know them yet. So association leaders across the country find themselves in the same boat, not sure what they should do. And because of that, they're indecisive and they're making the same mistakes over and over and over. And those are preventable problems. We don't want you floundering about how to lead your association well when it comes to reserves. We present these webinars because we want you to make wise, strategic reserve decisions, the kind of decisions that lead towards an improved future for your association. And that's what DJ and I intend to do today in the time we're together. As you know, it all boils down to being in a board meeting or a budget meeting where you make decisions. But as I said, you need some training to know how to avoid simple mistakes and how to make those wise decisions that stand the test of time and point your association in the right direction. So settle in, adjust your volume so you can hear us well, and let's set you up for success. So in today, the next 30 minutes, we're going to take you from being unsure about basic reserve budget issues to being confident that you know the basics of the pros and cons of reserve-related decisions that are going to come your way. So today will be just simple truths, no maths or detailed concepts. We have other webinars on different detailed aspects of reserve studies that we'll be presenting live throughout the year, and you can find some pre-recorded versions or prior reserve study news programs on our website, www.reservestudy.com, or on YouTube. But today's session is the basics, a framework so you'll know your major decision points. We want to get you and your association moving successfully towards a desirable future. And as a reminder, this is a live presentation and everyone's been muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. I want to point out a few controls that you see on the screen. I like an interactive presentation, and DJ is used to speaking publicly, so every once in a while, if we ask for your feedback, the way to respond is to raise your hand electronically by clicking on the hand raise icon in your control panel. It's probably off on your right, that looks like the one you see on screen. So without further delay, let's give that a test. Give me a hands raised if you're ready to get going. Oh, wow, DJ, this is a quick group. Hands raised all up and down my list. Okay, I'm going to click hands down. And DJ, I'm going to turn it over to you. They're all yours.
Great, thank you, Robert. I want to get back to that board meeting scenario. As we know, the board is responsible to run the association and make decisions to protect and preserve its assets so they can be enjoyed by the homeowners. Most governing documents clearly assign the board with both the power and the duty to collect funds to run the affairs of the association. This includes the daily, weekly, and monthly issues that you handle from the operating budget. It also includes preparing for the big expenses related to the association's major physical assets, which you address through reserves. But doing this can be a challenge, considering that everything at the association is in a constant state of deterioration, so it's a moving target. The goal in all this planning is to create a successful, financially stable community with pride of ownership and maximize property values. Here are 4 simple reserve rules that will help guide you as you move forward. If this is all you get from the entire webinar today, it will have been a good use of your time. So first, expenses always happen. They're inevitable. The board is responsible to have a plan to handle those expenses. Delays in performing the work usually create extra costs, and the homeowners always get stuck paying the bill. Too many boards have the mistaken belief that they succeed by minimizing homeowner assessments. Now, it's okay to want to keep assessments low, but that's the wrong goal. The board's primary responsibility is to take care of the needs of the association, and it's the manager's job to keep the board on track and help them develop an adequate budget. Minimizing the income to the association starves the association of the funds it needs to operate, which is then going to result in disappointment, discouragement, deterioration, and declining property values. But that's a topic we'll cover in another webinar. Just make sure you don't miss the mark by setting low assessments as the goal. Now, this chart shows reserve contribution recommendations for our clients as a fraction of their total budget. Your major assets are deteriorating every day, and reserve contributions offset that ongoing cost of deterioration. There's no escaping that fact. We typically talk about reserve contributions accounting for anywhere from 15 to 40% of an association's total budget. Now, the high point on this chart is right around the 25% mark, which shows most associations need to be allocating about 25% of their total budget to their reserves. What's important, of course, is where your association lies on this chart. Your association could be at the 15% end of the scale or the 40% end of the scale. Your reserve study will tell you how much reserve contributions need to be in order to offset the cost of ongoing deterioration. Next, we have some photos of common deterioration we see while conducting site inspections. If you don't give your association the funds it needs to sustain itself, because you're focused on minimizing reserve contributions and aren't offsetting ongoing deterioration, you'll get hit with a double whammy. Your association will look like this, which results in decreasing property values. Then the lack of proper maintenance in an effort to save money is actually going to increase your costs, because the maintenance and repair work you deferred turns into more expensive replacements instead. Now, this photo here shows a simple iron fence that should have been painted regularly to prevent rusting. The lack of proper maintenance to save money has resulted in the need for a much more expensive fence replacement project. This next photo shows wood trim, which also needs regular painting. Now, failing to paint the wood trim when needed takes the project from a simple repaint to a larger project that needs more extensive carpentry repairs. So these are just a few examples to illustrate that associations focusing on the objective to minimize homeowner assessments often end up with much higher expenses.
Hey, DJ, let me follow up on that with an opportunity to make another important point. And let me ask the audience a question here. Are reserve contributions for the present or the future? And Paige, can you launch the poll on this?
Yes, I can. It has been launched. Go ahead and make your selection. Okay, answers are coming in. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, Robert, answers are in. Looks like 87% say for the future and 13% say for the present.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Paige. That's an important point. I hope you heard DJ talking there where he was talking about reserve contributions offset ongoing deterioration. We don't say reserve contributions are for the future. And that change of phrase, that simple change of phrase right there is going to make a big difference to your homeowners and the way you communicate to your homeowners. Now, the actual expense, of course, happens at a future point in time when the project is actually accomplished. But the deterioration was steady over time. Reserve contributions are not for a guess about an expense 20 years into the future. Reserve contributions pay to offset that steady and predictable daily, weekly, and monthly deterioration that occurs over the life of the component. It makes reserve expenses much more like an operating expense, which, again, DJ explained a moment ago as the daily, weekly, monthlies. And just like those reserve contributions are not for the future, in a reserve study, we aren't making guesses about the future. we're just looking around when we're on property to see and report what your components look like at this time. And then from our experience, we know how long those assets typically last. And then you tell us how much money you have to work with. And then we just design a plan so you'll be prepared for those expenses, collecting enough funds along over the time, and so that they're ready when the project actually happens. Then, of course, we update that plan and update it again every year, every few years, so we're never making projections about the far distant future. Because we firmly believe that if you're making properly budgeted ongoing reserve contributions along the way, offsetting deterioration, then you're going to be in balance. The funds are going to exist in the future in order to do your projects on time.
Now here's a chart that shows an example of reserve expenses through the years. They're all over the place. It looks very irregular. In some years, the reserve expenses are large. In other years, very small or maybe even zero. So now you're thinking, how do we prepare for all those irregular expenses? You can see why some associations just throw up their hands and attempt to collect special assessments as needed. But let me tell you why that's not a good plan. Over the long run, you could argue that special assessing for reserve projects will even out. However, homeowners come and go. They typically don't live in a community for an extended period of time, so special assessing is just unfair. Although reserve expenses are irregular in regards to timing, remember that they are predictable, not random. So if you go back to the four reserve rules slide from a few minutes ago, the board is responsible to provide for the expenses of the association. The ongoing cost of deterioration is as real as the water bill and the insurance bill. You need to set your budget so it gets paid, because it's part of the cost of living at your association. As a sneak preview, we're doing a funding plan development webinar in April, where we'll spend more time on the subject of reserve contribution strategies and special assessments. So to finish off the basics of this issue, it boils down to being fiscally responsible by paying a bill that you know to be real. It's fair that all owners pay their fair share along the way as part of their ongoing assessments. And doing projects on time actually saves money by preventing costly deferred maintenance. Remember the 4 reserve rules. Don't make things more expensive for the homeowners by delaying.
Well, thanks, DJ. I noticed that you didn't say anything about state laws driving reserve contributions and those state requirements. Was that on purpose?
Yeah, Robert, we're sticking to the basics here, and we don't have time to talk about roughly 25 states that have laws requiring something about reserves. But it really boils down to needing to set aside an adequate reserve amount to prepare for your own expenses. You don't make reserve contributions because of state laws.
Well said. You plan for reserves, we believe, because the association just fundamentally needs the funds. Reserve deterioration is a predictable expense, and it takes many years to collect enough reserves in small, steady amounts to be able to pay for those large projects. Now let me go back to the audience again. Let me know you're sticking with us and are ready for us to move on to new topics, reserve study types, and the parts of the reserve study. So give me a show of hands if you're ready for us to move on. Same thing as before. Very quick. Everyone's with us. Okay, I'm going to click hands down. Thank you. Well, now's a good time as we begin kind of the second half of the program to let you all know that the points we're making today are all based on national reserve study standards, and those have been in place since 1998. All the terminology and calculations we talk about today are standardized nationally. And to start with, reserve studies come in 3 types. And that little seal on the top right of the slide means that this is defined in National Reserve Study standards. One of the 3 types is a full reserve study, another is an update with site visit, and the third is an update no site visit. The full reserve study is created from scratch. It's done when no reserve study exists. A site inspection identifies, evaluates, quantifies, meaning everything's measured, all the appropriate assets, and we get those pictures that we showed you just a moment ago. An update with site visit reserve study includes a site inspection to observe and update all the conditions of the components, yet it's less expensive than a full reserve study because we're not spending a lot of time measuring, and because the component list exists and we have a good handle on what's there at the association. The Update No Site Visit Reserve Study involves updating the existing reserve study, basically refreshing all that life and cost information based on the amount of time that's elapsed, basically the years, and then we interview the association representatives and the vendors. That might be the board, the manager, the major vendors, and because there's no site visit involved, it's the least expensive professional reserve study level of service. Now, because a typical association only needs to perform a reserve study that's the full type, the full level of service once, meaning if you've got 80,000 square feet of asphalt, you got 80,000 square feet of asphalt. You don't need to pay someone to remeasure it. Most of the reserve studies an association will do will either be the update with site visit or the update no site visit options. And the with site visit updates are typically accomplished every few years, and the no site visit updates are typically done in the years in between those with site visit updates. That's how those two work together. Now let me show you how this works and what it means to the association. In our experience, we have kind of three categories of clients. We have a category that updates every 5 years, a category that updates every 3 years, and then a category that updates annually. So let me walk you through that. Here's a slide that shows clients who update every 5 years. That might be because that's what they feel is right for their association. It might be driven by their local state law. But they, of course, start with a full reserve study, and they hire us to come on site every 5th year to update that information. And what we find is that 5 years is a long time to go between reserve study updates. And that's because you're talking about reserve contributions that are a very large budget line item, often, as DJ showed, as big as 25% or more of your total assessments. And so the question is that still doing what it needs to do? Is it still on track? So for our every 5-year clients, we find that 33% of those need a special assessment because they don't have enough reserves to do the necessary projects. They've drifted that far off target. So another common category is the every 3-year types. And again, maybe because of state law, maybe because of what they feel is the right interval for their association. Again, they started with the full reserve study sometime back when, and then they hire us to come on site every 3rd year for an update. Again, that's their pattern. For this category of client, they update obviously a little more frequently than every 5th year. And for these, on average, we recommend a special assessment 30% of the time. That's a little bit down from 33%, and that shows that updating more frequently has its merits, but that's not a big deal. But let me take you one more step to show you something interesting. We have a large category of clients that hire us every year, effectively using those 3 types of reserve studies like you see on screen, the full, no site visit, and the with site visit. When you do this kind of pattern where you're having us on site every 3rd year and filling in between with those inexpensive no site visit updates, there's not a lot of budget drift. Only 21% of those clients need a special assessment. And that's a big drop in special assessment frequency. The minor cost of a no site visit update to tune up that huge reserve contribution line item pays off with fewer disruptive special assessments, and those associations enjoy lower costs from eliminating that expensive deferred maintenance that DJ was talking about a few moments ago.
Hey, Robert, let me follow up on that theme. Like you said, there are 3 types of reserve studies. There's also 3 parts of a reserve study. So a reserve study tells you what you're reserving for, how well your reserve fund compares to the needs of the association, and what contributions are necessary from this point going forward. So we're going to start with the reserve component list, which is what we call the foundation of the reserve study because all the other results are based on the component list. Now here's a sample reserve component list that contains each project's description, its useful life, which means how often it's occurring, the remaining useful life, which shows when it's going to happen next, and its current replacement cost. Now, this list was actually the source of that very irregular looking expense chart I showed earlier. Those expenses may appear random when they're spread across the years in a chart, but remember that while the expenses have irregular timing, the deterioration is stable and predictable. Since the component list is so important, National Reserve Study Standards created a 4-part test to determine which projects are appropriate for reserve funding. If a project passes all these tests, it should be funded through reserves. So starting at the top left of your screen, the project in question needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility of the association with a limited useful life, a predictable remaining life, meaning you can see it coming, and it needs to be above a minimum threshold cost of significance. That's often somewhere in the range of 0.5% to 1% of the association's annual budget. So you can use this same 4-part test to review the contents of your reserve component list. And one thing I want to point out before we leave this screen is that I'm inviting you to join us for a Reserve Study Webinar 101 in March. And this is a webinar that's going to go a little bit deeper into the reserve component list and talk about how we develop that and explore different components. The second part of a reserve study is the calculation of reserve fund strength, which answers the question, do we have enough? Now, the question about enough is answered by a comparison of the association's cash versus its needs. If an association has a lot of money, whatever the amount that is, but it has more deterioration than cash, then it's in a reserve deficit situation. The opposite is also true. If the association has more in its reserve fund than the value of deterioration, then it has a reserve surplus. This comparison is called percent funded. It reveals the balance between deterioration and the amount of cash at the association. And both of these figures change each year. An association at 100% funded is called fully funded, and that's when the cash in reserves equals the deteriorated portion of its reserve components. I want to emphasize that we're measuring the reserve cash against the current calculated value of deterioration. Like a $100,000 roof that's halfway used up has $50,000 of deterioration. So deterioration is not the total replacement value of all the reserve components. And knowing your percent funded is important. It's kind of like a bank credit score since it measures risk. This chart illustrates the relationship between percent funded and special assessment risk. When an association has relatively little cash compared to deterioration, special assessments are more common. It's pretty intuitive, actually. When an association is in that 0 to 30% funded range, which we refer to as the weak range, special assessments are common. Now, they're not for sure, but they are more common. The opposite is also true. When percent funded is above the 70% level, special assessments are rare. Now, we're not saying they'll never happen, but they're rare. Percent funded helps you know what your association's general risk exposure is to special assessments. The third part of a reserve study is a calculated multi-year funding plan to answer the question of how much you should be reserving on an ongoing basis to be prepared. Remember, it boils down to being prepared for the anticipated expenses defined in your reserve component list. So being prepared means the money has been set aside so that it's there when you need to spend it. All associations are different. They have different sizes, ages, materials, asset lists, maintenance, owner expectations, and reserve fund strength. So how much to contribute is not a one-size-fits-all answer. And we tell boards this is the only portion of the reserve study that requires their action. The recommended funding plan is a call to action, and that means making transfers to the reserve fund. Remember that it's the board's job to care for the assets of the association on behalf of the owners. Failing to do that exposes those assets to deferred maintenance or unfairly burdens future owners with the expense of replacing a project that deteriorated long before they became an owner in the association. Now, this is an example of a pool that was left to deteriorate. In addition to the embarrassment of not having enough money to do this very predictable project, just think of what this does for home values when prospective buyers walk through the association. Now compare it to this pool at one of our client associations where they have the cash to do their repair and replacement projects in a timely manner. For just a few more dollars a month, everyone pays their fair share on an ongoing basis, and the common areas and property values both look great. At this association, owners don't worry about special assessments. So can you give me a hands raised if you can see the difference between this real result of making timely, properly sized reserve contributions?
Looking up and down the list, DJ, yep, they're all tracking with you. And I like that pool comparison. That's a pretty good blue to green comparison of pool condition. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising that we actually see that stuff, but it does happen.
It is. Well, that's why we do these webinars, because these are preventable problems. And it's just, like you said, a few dollars a month. And that makes a big impact on home values. So let me click hands down and turn it back to you.
All right. So the question is, how much cash will you need to set aside on a smooth, regular basis to have enough reserves, like the blue line shows here, to be able to perform your reserve projects in a timely manner? Or what's the value of having a little bit more, having a bit of margin for when pricing changes or when something deteriorates faster than you expected? For that, you'll need a little bit more in reserves, like the green line shows here. That will take a little more time to explain, so join us for our Reserve Studies 102 webinar on April 7th, when we'll talk about the pros and cons of having a little margin in your reserve fund. Remember, reserve component deterioration is expensive. Your components will deteriorate whether you're making reserve contributions or not. The only choice you have is if you make properly sized reserve contributions, keeping everything fair for your owners, protecting them from special assessments, and maximizing their home values. Or on the other hand, you might be exposing them to special assessments and weak home values. Update your reserve study and find out what's the right balance for your association this year. Now here's another way to show it on a pie chart. Reserve contributions are often a significant portion of an association's budget. As I said earlier, typically 15 to 40%. A pretty common number is 25% of the total budget, as shown here. You can do some calculations after the webinar to see where your association is and get an idea of where you might need to be moving. If your reserve contributions are less than 25% of the total budget, there's a good chance you're gradually falling behind on your reserve obligations. And if your reserve contributions are less than 10%, it is highly likely one or more special assessments are in your near future. If your percent funded is low and your contributions are low, you might need to make a big change. But don't worry, you don't have to solve this problem overnight. Most associations got themselves into a reserve deficit over many years, and most associations can take a few years to change direction and get their budget balanced. So take a step in the right direction. Maybe you increase your reserve contributions $10 a unit per month this year. Based on your association's needs, do it again next year, and again the following year if necessary, in $10 increments. That's a very workable plan.
Well, thanks, DJ. We like to call that the $10 solution. It's a very workable plan for associations that are in a jam. They often don't need to solve a big problem immediately. Well, we like to say here that an improved future is worth the journey, and your reserve study professional can guide you there with an updated reserve study, and it's all based on National Reserve Study standards. That's what we do here. So that's a pretty quick outline of reserve study basics. There's so much more we could have shared with you on this topic. DJ tempted you with a few more webinars coming up on more advanced aspects, and I hope you'll join us for those live webinars throughout the year. In addition, you can find a deep library of written materials and recordings of prior webinars on the resources tab of our website, www.reservestudy.com. If you heard about this webinar from someone else, go to our website and scroll down to the bottom where you can sign up for our email list and get the notifications straight for yourself. Or sign up somebody else. Have your other board members join us Our webinars are free, so encourage those other managers or board members to sign up and take advantage of this free training. We've got a great schedule of webinars coming up this year on reserve study or related financial or board leadership topics with some pretty impressive guest speakers. And like I showed on that first slide of the View Outside unit number 8 there, we are here to help with training so you can make wise decisions that lead your association towards a more secure future. And if we can help with a reserve study update, by all means click on the Request a Proposal link that you'll find at the top right corner of our website. And let me give you a sneak preview of our next webinar, announcing a new resource we have here in 2021. We just published a book called Understanding Reserves. So join us for our book launch webinar discussion with the authors on February 17. Now, while you can order it on Amazon today, we're planning to raffle off some signed copies of the book for attendees of our book launch webinar. So put that date on your calendar and join us. And we hope that we've been able to give you a few insights today to empower or inspire you to take some positive steps of change. Do it for your association. Do it for your homeowners. We want the best for you and your association. So get as far as you can with our free resources and let us know when you need our professional assistance. And that wraps up the prepared portion of today's webinar, and we'll transition to a brief Q&A time. So at this point in time, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will serve as our MC. Paige.